Imagine raising a boy to rule the world, only for him to kill you in your bedroom. No trial, no mercy. Just steel through the belly, ordered by your own flesh and blood. This emperor didn't just commit murder. He staged it like theater. He smiled through the screams. He killed not out of hate, but fear. And in doing so, sealed his fate as one of the most terrifying figures in Roman history. The grand halls of the imperial palace echoed with the sounds of celebration. Nero, the young heir to Rome's throne, stood at the center of it all, his boyish face radiating innocence. Yet his mother, Agrippina, was always the unseen force behind him. She was the one who maneuvered through the empire's intricate web of politics, whispering in the ears of senators and generals, while her son basked in the glory of their success. To the people of Rome, Nero was the golden child, destined for greatness. But in truth, he was little more than a puppet. Agrippina, who had risen to power through her marriage to the Emperor Claudius, had no intention of relinquishing her hold. From the very beginning, she saw in Nero not just a son, but a tool, one she could manipulate to secure her own position at the pinnacle of Roman power. She had made sure that Nero would be the next emperor, pushing Claudius to adopt him as his heir, even over his own biological son, Britannicus. Agrippina's ambition knew no bounds. For years, the people of Rome marveled at the youthful emperor, his face painted in the splendor of Roman divinity. But while Nero smiled and accepted the adoration of the masses, his mother's grip over him tightened with each passing day. Agrippina controlled the Senate, the military, and the people, leaving Nero with little more than the title of emperor. His reign was a mere reflection of her power. Every decision, every decree, made by Agrippina, not her son. At first, Nero reveled in his position. He was the emperor, after all. What could be better than the adulation of an empire? But as time passed, a bitter truth began to form in his heart. The throne that was meant to be his was not entirely his own. It was Agrippina's creation. He was a puppet, and she was the puppet master. The more he saw of her control, the more he felt the suffocating weight of her dominance. A new feeling began to stir within him, resentment. A son cannot forever remain in the shadow of his mother, no matter how powerful she may be. And as the boy who had once been Rome's golden child began to mature into a man, he would come to realize one undeniable truth. There was no room for two rulers in the empire of Rome. And so began the slow unraveling of their bond. With every step she took, her influence grew, until he could no longer bear the shadow she cast. But how far would a son go when the throne feels more like a cage? The descent into madness begins here. Agrippina's rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary. The blood of emperors ran through her veins, and she knew how to wield it like a weapon. Her ambition was a fire that could not be quenched, and it burned through the halls of the imperial palace, consuming all in its path. The Senate, the generals, and even her own husband, Emperor Claudius, were mere pawns in her grand scheme. It was Agrippina who controlled the strings of Rome, and it was Agrippina who would decide who sat on the throne. She had no love for her son Nero, not in the way a mother should. She didn't raise him out of affection, but out of a cold calculation. Nero was a means to an end. He was her ticket to ruling Rome directly, and she knew that for her plans to succeed, he had to be seen as the rightful heir. Agrippina carefully orchestrated his adoption by Claudius, ensuring that Nero would ascend to the throne rather than Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. She did what was necessary to ensure her hold on the empire was absolute, and that Nero would be the figurehead through which she would exert her dominance. As Nero grew older, the grip of his mother's influence grew stronger. Every aspect of his life was under her control, from the advisors he trusted to the decisions he made. Agrippina was there, pulling the strings, steering him in the direction she wanted. She ensured that the empire's power remained in her hands while Nero wore the crown. To Rome, it appeared as if the young emperor was in charge. But behind closed doors, it was Agrippina who held all the cards. The people adored Nero. He was young, charismatic, and charming. But to him, the adulation felt hollow. Every moment of glory was another reminder that he was not in control. His every move was dictated by his mother's will. His own thoughts were clouded by the realization that the throne he sat upon was not truly his, and his mother's shadow loomed large over everything he did. As the years passed, that feeling of suffocation grew. Agrippina was a force that consumed everything around her, and now her son's very soul was at risk. But how long could a son tolerate being nothing more than a puppet? Nero began to question the price of his throne and what he was willing to sacrifice to claim it fully. With every step she took, her influence grew, until he could no longer bear the shadow she cast. But how far would a son go when the throne feels more like a cage? The descent into madness begins here. The tension inside the imperial palace became palpable, like the heavy air before a storm. Nero's smile, once a symbol of innocence and power, began to fade as the weight of his mother's control pressed harder on him. He had always known Agrippina was ambitious, but now it became painfully clear she did not view him as her son, but as the key to her own power. His every move, every decision was shaped by her iron grip. There was no room for him to breathe, to make choices that were truly his own. His reign was a lie, a crown that belonged to his mother, not him. At first, Nero tried to convince himself that it was for the greater good. Rome needed stability, and his mother had provided that. She had ensured his rise to power, protected him from the dangers of palace intrigue, and built his reputation as an emperor worthy of admiration. But as the years went by, the bitterness began to sour in his gut. What good was a throne if it came with no freedom? What was the point of being emperor if you weren't truly in charge? The more he observed Agrippina's hold on the empire, the more suffocating it became. She was always in the background, pulling the strings, ensuring that no one could challenge her control. Senators came and went at her command. Generals bowed to her authority. Even the court itself seemed to orbit around her. Her words were law, and those who disobeyed her swiftly disappeared from the political landscape, exiled or silenced. Nero's frustration boiled over. The dream of ruling Rome as its emperor had become a nightmare of subjugation. What made matters worse was that the people of Rome adored him. His every gesture, his every move was greeted with cheers. But the crowd didn't know the truth. They didn't know that their emperor was nothing more than a puppet whose strings were pulled by the iron hands of his mother. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He was nothing without his mother. The emperor, the symbol of Rome's power, had no power of his own. He was trapped in a gilded cage, living a lie, a prisoner of his own position. And in the back of his mind, something darker began to take root. If Rome was truly his, why was he unable to wield it? In the silence of his chambers, Nero began to plot. The thought of dethroning his mother, of finally standing on his own 2 feet, began to take form. The idea was tempting. After all, how could a son ever truly be free if his mother still controlled the empire? She had been a shadow over him for too long, and now he would do whatever it took to shake her from his life, to sever the connection between them, no matter the cost. It was the beginning of his descent. Once, he had been the boy who wore the crown with innocence. Now the crown had become a weight too heavy to bear, and as he grew more resentful, more desperate for autonomy, Nero realized that the only way to gain true control of his empire was to destroy the one person who had given him everything. The son's resentment boils over. Whispers of betrayal echo in the corridors of power. What happens when a ruler sees his mother not as a guide but as his greatest threat? The first deadly plans take shape. Nero's thoughts grew darker with each passing day. The seed of rebellion, once a fleeting thought in the back of his mind, began to blossom into a desperate plan. The realization that he could never be free while his mother ruled his every move gnawed at him, and soon the idea of her removal consumed him entirely. He began to imagine the possibilities. The throne would be his. Rome would be his. No longer would he live under the shadow of Agrippina's suffocating grip. He knew the consequences of such a decision. To kill his mother was no small matter. She was not just any woman, she was Agrippina, a force of nature whose influence reached into every corner of the empire. Her death would send shockwaves through Rome, and the people would not forgive him easily. But that didn't matter. What was the empire worth if it came at the cost of his soul, his freedom? What was the worth of his crown if he wasn't the one who truly wore it? The first thought that came to his mind was poison. It was the perfect weapon, silent, discreet, and deadly. Agrippina, after all, was no stranger to the world of poisonings. She had used it as a tool throughout her rise to power, eliminating rivals and enemies without a trace. It was fitting that the very weapon she had used to manipulate the world around her would be the one to bring her downfall. Nero had seen firsthand the subtlety of poison, how it could strike without warning, and yet without the evidence of bloodshed. He began to search for ways to accomplish the deed. His most trusted advisors, those who had been loyal to him but also fearful of his mother's wrath, were eager to assist in her demise. The plan was simple. Poison her food, make it appear as an accident. After all, Agrippina had made many enemies over the years, so her death would not immediately raise suspicion. It would be a quiet, unremarkable death, and Nero would finally be free. But as with all things in the imperial court, nothing went according to plan. Nero's first attempt to poison his mother was a failure. Agrippina, ever vigilant, suspected something was wrong with her wine. She had lived too long in the palace of schemers to fall for such an obvious ploy. She drank the wine, but only a small sip, and within moments she grew suspicious. As the poison began to take its toll, Agrippina stopped herself, coughing violently and pushing the cup away. She demanded that her servants take her to bed, feigning weakness, but her mind was sharp. She knew what had happened and who had orchestrated it. The failed attempt left Nero furious. He had underestimated her, the very woman who had brought him to power. She was no ordinary mother, no passive ruler. She was a woman who had fought and clawed her way to the top, and she had survived every assassination attempt and every poison designed to end her life. Agrippina was not going to be so easily removed. Nero, however, was undeterred. His pride had been wounded, and he was no longer a boy frightened of his mother's power. He was a man, an emperor in his own mind, and nothing would stand in his way. He turned to a more ruthless method. He would send her into a trap from which there would be no escape. He tries to rid himself of her with poison, but she survives. How can you kill someone who refuses to die? The plot thickens, and a far more dangerous solution presents itself. The ship is ready to set sail. Nero's first attempt had failed, but it only fueled his resolve. His mother's resilience, the way she had evaded death, shattered his belief that he could outsmart her. Agrippina was not just a survivor. She was a master of manipulation, a woman whose survival instincts had kept her at the top of Roman politics for decades. But now, Nero would play a different game. His next plan would be as grand as it was deadly. He would take her out of the palace, far from the eyes of the Senate and the prying citizens, and into a carefully crafted trap. The idea came to him like a flash of brilliance, a cruel twist of fate, a shipwreck. The sea had claimed countless lives throughout history, and the people of Rome, superstitious as they were, would never suspect foul play in the open waters. It was the perfect crime. Agrippina was known for her love of sailing, for taking leisurely trips on the ships that dotted the Roman Empire's coastline. She trusted the sea, its calming rhythms, and its vast, indifferent power. What better place to end her life than in the embrace of the very thing she loved? Nero ordered the construction of a magnificent ship, one that would appear as an extravagant gift for his mother, a gesture of loyalty from the son she had shaped into the emperor he was. But this was no mere gift. The ship, designed with an opulent interior and beautiful decorations, concealed deadly intentions beneath its gilded surface. Nero ensured the ship was built with a secret flaw. It would be rigged to collapse at sea, taking his mother down in an accident. No one would suspect a thing. Agrippina would die, and Nero would finally be free. When the ship was ready, Nero invited his mother aboard. It was a perfect day for sailing, and Agrippina, ever the trusting mother, boarded the vessel with her usual confidence. Nero accompanied her, putting on the mask of a dutiful son, his heart racing as the ship left the harbor. The sea, however, had other plans. Just as the ship sailed farther from the coast, something went terribly wrong. The carefully constructed collapse mechanism was triggered, and the vessel began to sink. The water rushed in, pulling the ship toward its doom. But to Nero's shock, Agrippina did not scream. She did not panic. Instead, she acted with a calmness that sent a chill down Nero's spine. Agrippina, it seemed, had known something was amiss from the start. She had seen the signs, the way the ship felt unstable, the slight tilting that betrayed a design not made for safety. She had grown accustomed to danger over the years, and even as the ship began to break apart, she managed to escape. The crew, too, were in a state of chaos, but Agrippina was determined. She fought her way out of the sinking ship, eventually making her way to shore. Nero's plan had backfired spectacularly. His mother had survived yet again, and worse still, she had done so with remarkable resilience. The news spread like wildfire through Rome. Agrippina's near-death experience was a topic of hushed conversations, but no one suspected the emperor had orchestrated the entire affair. He had failed, and worse, his mother had been stronger than ever. A perfect plan, a ship designed to kill her at sea. But fate has a different idea. The hunt is on, and she's still alive. What will he do next to erase the woman who won't die? Agrippina's survival of the shipwreck sent shockwaves through the imperial palace. Nero's plan had failed in the most spectacular fashion. The ship that was supposed to be his mother's final resting place became her unexpected triumph. The cruel irony was not lost on him. He had designed the ship with every intention of sending her to a watery grave, but Agrippina, ever the survivor, had somehow escaped yet again. Once more, she defied death. For Nero, the humiliation was unbearable. Agrippina had cheated death not once, but twice now, through poison and the collapsing ship. The more he tried to rid himself of her, the more it seemed she grew stronger, as if fate itself had sided with her. The very woman he had once idolized, the woman who had raised him to be emperor, now stood as his greatest obstacle. She was the ghost in his life, haunting him with every failed attempt, every miscalculation. Yet as Nero brooded in the silence of his chambers, Agrippina did not gloat. She did not openly confront him about his treachery. Instead, she played a silent, dangerous game of her own. It was in the days that followed the failed shipwreck that Nero received the message he would never forget, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Agrippina, with her usual poise and composure, sent word to her son through one of her trusted servants. But it wasn't just any message. It was a single line, a cold, calculated statement. "You should have done better." Those words echoed in Nero's mind as though they were a prophecy. He had failed. She had lived despite all his attempts to kill her. The message wasn't just a taunt, it was a statement of power. Agrippina knew she had the upper hand. She was no longer just a mother to Nero, she had become a symbol of everything he could not control. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. But it wasn't just the words that struck him, it was the way Agrippina delivered them. She had mastered the art of psychological warfare, leaving him with a deep sense of humiliation. The failure wasn't just on the surface, it dug into the very core of who he was. Nero had never felt more powerless. The very woman he had tried to destroy now held his fate in her hands. For Nero, the realization was crippling. His every thought became consumed by the fear that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, he could never escape her. Agrippina's survival had become more than a personal vendetta. It had become a force that threatened his very identity as emperor. Her words had shattered the illusion of control he had so desperately clung to. And with that realization came a terrifying certainty. The more he tried to sever his ties with her, the more entangled they became. Nero could no longer ignore the truth. Agrippina's presence in his life was not just a burden, it was a curse. And now, the son who had once adored her would have to face the harsh reality. If he was ever going to be truly free, he would have to destroy the very thing that had given him life. She survives it all and sends him a message that will haunt him for the rest of his life. But in the end, a son will do whatever it takes to rid himself of his mother. He won't stop until she's gone, no matter the cost. The weight of failure pressed heavily on Nero's chest. Every night, he lay awake in his lavish bed, unable to shake the haunting thought of his mother's survival. Agrippina had slipped through his fingers yet again. He had tried poison. He had tried the shipwreck. He had even ordered her death with the certainty that she would not survive. Yet here she was, alive, unscathed, and still holding dominion over him. Each attempt to kill her had failed, and with every failure, the walls of his empire seemed to close in. Nero had been raised to believe he was a god, the ruler of an empire that stretched across continents, but the reality was far less glamorous. He was a puppet, controlled by the very mother who had placed him on the throne. It was a truth that gnawed at him until he could no longer stand it. The time for subtlety, for plots and poison was over. It was time for something more direct, something more final. Nero, humiliated and desperate, decided that there would be no more games. He would no longer play the part of the weak, reluctant son. He would take control once and for all. If his mother could not be controlled through manipulation, then she would be destroyed with force, face to face. He summoned his trusted guards, men loyal only to him, and ordered them to prepare for the task. This time, it would be different. He would not rely on subterfuge. Agrippina would be killed by his hand in the open, and there would be no questions afterward. No more pretending, no more games. Agrippina was summoned to the imperial palace under the guise of a peaceful meeting. She had survived every attempt on her life thus far, but even she could not anticipate what awaited her now. When she entered the room, Nero greeted her with a cold smile, pretending to be the dutiful son, but inside, his mind was racing. He had made his decision. The time for games was over. They spoke briefly, the pleasantries of royalty masking the tension thick in the air. Nero's words were measured, but his mind was consumed with thoughts of what would happen next. He had planned everything carefully, leaving nothing to chance. His guards waited in the wings, ready to act at his command. And then, in a single horrifying moment, the emperor's mask slipped. Nero's calm demeanor turned to one of cold determination, and in that instant, he gave the signal. His guards moved in swiftly, surrounding Agrippina. The struggle was brief, but violent. Nero stood there watching as his mother, the woman who had shaped his rise to power, fought for her life. It was a struggle that mirrored their entire relationship, a clash of wills, a fight for dominance. Agrippina, however, was not easily subdued. Even in that moment, she fought back with the ferocity of a woman who had survived everything Rome had thrown at her. She knew she was on the edge of death, but she was not going to surrender without a fight. For a moment, it seemed as if she might survive once again. But this time, the end came swiftly. Nero's order was final, and Agrippina was silenced. Nero stood there in the aftermath, watching his mother's body, and for the first time, he felt a strange emptiness. The empire was now his, fully and completely, yet instead of victory, he was left with the cold realization that the woman who had shaped him, who had given him everything, was gone forever. He had won, but at what cost? The moment has come. The final act in this twisted drama, a son's hands on his mother's life. But after the deed is done, will he truly escape the consequences of such a brutal act? Rome will never be the same. The palace fell into a heavy silence after Agrippina's death. Nero stood over her lifeless body, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just done. The guards, his loyal men, had swiftly carried out his orders, but none of them dared meet his eyes. The finality of the act hung in the air like a dark cloud. It was over, or so he thought. Rome had seen its share of power struggles, betrayals, and assassinations, but never before had it witnessed a matricide so cold, so direct. The Senate was silent. The people of Rome murmured in hushed tones, unsure of what to make of the news. Was this the act of an emperor who had taken control of his empire, or the desperate, violent act of a son whose mother had crushed him under her power for too long? At first, Nero believed that his actions would be justified. He had killed his mother to free himself from her grasp, to finally claim the throne that was rightfully his. He imagined that the people would rally behind him, that his rise would be seen as the end of a dark chapter. But as the days passed, the weight of his decision began to settle on him like a burden too heavy to bear. Rome's reaction was far from the celebration he had anticipated. The Senate, long dominated by Agrippina's influence, was silent. They dared not speak openly for fear of angering the emperor, but behind closed doors, whispers spread like wildfire. Was Agrippina a tyrant, or was Nero now the true monster? The people, who had once adored him, began to turn. The glimmer of his rule, once shining brightly, began to dull. Nero had won the throne, but in doing so, he had lost the trust of the very people he sought to control. In the streets of Rome, rumors ran wild. The citizens whispered about the emperor's unnatural relationship with his mother. They spoke of his cruelty, of the way he had ordered her death so coldly. And in the shadows, his enemies began to gather, sensing an opportunity to weaken his reign. The empire was a dangerous place for an emperor whose own actions had inspired fear rather than loyalty. Even within the walls of the imperial palace, the air was thick with tension. Nero could no longer sleep. The ghost of his mother, the woman who had shaped him into what he was, seemed to haunt every corner of his mind. It was not just the physical presence of her death that tormented him, it was the psychological weight. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, eyes full of betrayal and accusation. His own mind was unraveling. He had killed his mother. He had destroyed the very foundation of his life, and now he could not escape the crushing weight of his guilt. The empire was his, but it felt empty. The crown, once a symbol of power, now seemed like a burden. As days turned into weeks, Nero's paranoia grew. He saw conspirators in every shadow, heard traitors in every whisper. Rome had held its breath when Agrippina died, but now it seemed to hold something darker, a collective unease that spread throughout the empire. Was this the beginning of the end for Nero? Or would the boy who had killed his mother truly become the emperor he had always imagined? The city holds its breath as the empire trembles. Was it murder or justice? But for this emperor, the nightmare is just beginning. What happens when even the ghosts of the past refuse to stay buried? The halls of the imperial palace, once a place of grandeur and celebration, had now become a house of whispers and shadows. Every corner of Nero's mind was filled with echoes of the act he had committed. Agrippina's death had been swift, but the consequences were far more insidious. The emperor's days were marked by a growing sense of dread, a feeling that there was no escape from the consequences of his matricide. Nero had expected to feel liberated after his mother's death. He thought that with her gone, the weight of the throne would finally rest entirely upon his shoulders, and that he would be free to rule as he saw fit. But the truth was far darker. The more he tried to assert his authority, the more the memories of Agrippina's power and influence haunted him. It wasn't just the guilt of what he had done. It was the constant reminder that he had severed the most important tie in his life, the very one that had shaped his rise to power. It began with the smallest things, the creaking of floorboards. At night, the distant sound of footsteps echoing down empty hallways. Nero would turn, expecting to see his mother standing there, ready to scold him, to remind him of the empire he had inherited. But when he looked, there was nothing, just the silent emptiness of the palace. Nights were the worst. Alone in his bed, Nero would hear whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He would sit up, heart racing, and listen to the sound of footsteps approaching, only to find his chambers empty. It was as though Agrippina's spirit lingered in the very fabric of the palace, haunting him with every step he took. His servants began to notice his odd behavior. They whispered to one another about the emperor's strange, erratic moods, his sudden outbursts, his refusal to sleep. Nero no longer trusted anyone, even those who had been loyal to him. He began to see traitors in every shadow, conspirators in every whisper. The ghosts of his mother's influence were everywhere, and they were slowly driving him mad. But it wasn't just his mind that was unraveling. Nero's reign began to show signs of decay. The empire, once united under his mother's guidance, now seemed to fracture under his leadership. His decisions were increasingly erratic, fueled by paranoia and a need to prove himself. The Senate, once terrified of Agrippina, now saw an opportunity. They began to question Nero's ability to rule. Senators who had once feared his mother's wrath now whispered about his instability, his violent nature, and his growing obsession with his late mother's ghost. Rome, which had once cheered for Nero's ascension to the throne, now watched with growing unease as their emperor spiraled into madness. What had once seemed like a glorious reign was quickly becoming a nightmare, and Nero, the boy who had once been the golden child of Rome, was now a man haunted by his own actions, tormented by the legacy of a mother he had murdered. His nights were filled with visions of Agrippina, her cold eyes accusing him, her voice echoing in the recesses of his mind. He could no longer escape the realization that he was alone in the empire he had inherited, the empire he had killed for. Haunted by visions, plagued by guilt, the emperor cannot escape the shadow of the mother he tried to erase. But the price of power is never paid in full. The empire's fall is imminent. The bloodshed he once controlled will now consume him. Nero's empire had become a cage, and every step he took within it echoed with the sound of his own collapse. The haunting visions of Agrippina's ghost were no longer just figments of his troubled mind. They were real. She was everywhere. Her presence, her memory, her legacy, all trapped in the walls of the palace and the darkest corners of his conscience. Each day, her shadow loomed over him, darker and more suffocating. He had achieved what he thought was the ultimate victory. Agrippina was dead. The throne was finally his. But as time wore on, Nero realized that the throne was a prison. one, made of his own blood, his mother's blood. Rome, once a city that hailed him as their emperor, now whispered behind his back. His actions, once seen as the natural assertion of power, were now perceived as madness. The empire, built upon the solid foundation laid by his mother, was beginning to crumble beneath his rule. The Senate, which had once bowed to Agrippina's will, began to plot against him. They saw in his erratic behavior a chance to regain the control they had lost. Behind the veil of diplomacy, they whispered of rebellion, of replacing Nero. The people too had begun to turn. The once adoring crowds now looked upon him with suspicion, their cheers growing quieter with each passing day. Nero's lavish games and grand spectacles, which once delighted the masses, had become empty distractions from the chaos unfolding within the empire. His need to be adored, to be loved, became more desperate, more frantic. But the love he craved slipped further from his grasp. It was not just the Senate or the people who posed a threat to Nero's reign. It was the very empire he ruled. His enemies were no longer just those who sought to overthrow him. They were the forces of history itself. Rome had always been a city built on power, violence, and betrayal. But the blood that had once nourished the empire had now become its curse. Nero's paranoia deepened. He saw conspirators everywhere. He believed that even his closest advisors were plotting against him. His trusted generals, once his allies, were now viewed with distrust. His actions became more tyrannical, more brutal. Executions became common, not just for traitors, but for anyone who dared question his authority. He sought to root out any potential challenge to his rule, no matter how small or insignificant. The more he tried to consolidate his power, the more he realized it was slipping through his fingers. And yet, no matter how many men he ordered executed, no matter how many plots he quelled with bloodshed, the shadow of his mother remained. Agrippina's voice still whispered in his ears, her cold eyes still watching him from every mirror, every reflection. The empire he had inherited had been built by her hand, and now it was falling apart beneath his. The bloodshed he had once used to build his power was now consuming him, dragging him deeper into the madness. Rome had fallen into a slow, suffocating decay under Nero's rule. The empire, once the greatest in the world, was now an empire of shadows. Nero had murdered his mother to free himself, but in the end, it was his own soul that was imprisoned. His name would be remembered not for the greatness he had hoped to achieve, but for the madness and destruction he had brought upon Rome. And so, the boy who had killed his mother in the hopes of becoming a god was now a man, alone and broken, forever haunted by the blood he had spilled.